In the name of the people, the Supreme Court of the People's Republic of Croatia in Zagreb, the council composed of judges of the Supreme Court, chaired by Žarko Vimpulšek as president of the council, on the 11th day of October 1946, issues the following verdict. The second accused, Dr. Aloysius Stepinac, is hereby sentenced to 16 years imprisonment and forced labor, and is deprived of all civil rights for a period of 5 years.
They brought him here on October the 19th, 1946. Many prison wardens recounted how prisoner Governor Šperenec went to see him in his cell on that day and asked, "What would you like for dinner?" Stepinac replied, "I'm here as a convict. I cannot have any wishes."
Gospodine Bože, izvore svetosti i milosti, blaženoga Alojzija, pastira i mučenika, pozvao si da ti služi kao...
Njegovo mučeništvo je dalo ljudima...
His martyrdom gave people a certain strength to survive, to bear it, patience and hope. That hope always emanated from him. A Stepinac is what the Croatian people miss today. Somebody with a moral authority. Somebody who all the people could trust.
Uvijek je bio nepodoban. Nepodoban je
He was always a misfit in a system that aimed to be wholly totalitarian, and not only rule over the whole of society, but also over the people's consciences. And that had nothing to do with a Catholic perspective, nor with an archbishop's rule.
ulogom koju nadbiskup ima.
Aloysius
Stepinac didn't just become a symbol for the Croatian people, for whom he was a beacon of light, but a symbol for the whole of Europe and perhaps even for the world, of how to defend the faith and the Church in times that are so very politically and socially complex.
Comrades, this court case finally provides an opportunity for those who have been misled to turn back, to gain an understanding of the gravity of the crime of which Dr. Stepinac is accused, that they might understand.
To se samo šaptom prošlo.
Stepinac has been imprisoned, was whispered about, and yet the trial against his whole group had already begun, including his secretary and Modesto Martincic, our provincial, 6 Franciscans in all. It was a big trial held in a gym. I listened to the trial over the radio. I cried. And I remember Stepinac's voice. I remember how aggressively prosecutor Blažević and Judge Vimpulšek interrupted him.
During the show trial, the Yugoslav Communists Court accused Dr. Aloysius Stepinac of criminal acts, political collaboration with the enemy occupying forces, undermining the country's political system, and hostile propaganda. A special section of the indictment against him dealt with war crimes, the forceful religious conversion of Serbs and Jews between 1941 and 1945.
When the German troops first arrived in Jelačić Square, film documentaries show this. The crowd was elated, cried out, and threw flowers on the tanks. They wanted a Croatian state above all else.
Iznad svega.
U početku uspostavljene nezavisne države...
As Croatia's independence was being constituted, all Croats welcomed and accepted the new political reality wholeheartedly, as it finally recognized the Croatian people's undoubted right to self-government. Both Archbishop Stepinac and all the remaining bishops welcomed the founding of the new state with satisfaction.
Ali mnogi su se vrlo brzo razočarali.
But many were bitterly disappointed when on May the 22nd, 1941, the government issued an order in accordance with Germany and Hitler's decree, obliging the Jews to wear something like a yellow rag with a black Jewish sign.
No anti-Semitism. I never felt it before the war. It all started overnight. We had to wear a cloth on our back, yellow with a black letter J. We had to go to the police to get it. Wearing it was dangerous. Not wearing it could mean banishment to a camp.
That really incensed Stepinac, Archbishop at the time, and he immediately objected publicly.
Neither concubines, nor adulterers, or even harlots are stigmatized with any visible mark. If, therefore, we do not ask this of people whose actions offend society, why do we ask this of people who bear no guilt, members of another race?
Cardinal Stepinac.
Cardinal Stepinac saved one of our girls who was the same age as me. She was walking home crying on the street because they had taken her mother away. Her brother was in a secret underground movement in the Communist Party, which was forbidden back then. Her father had been killed, and Stepinac took her by the hand and she told him who she was. He took her in and hid her for 4 years. He of course did this secretly. He couldn't make any announcement because they would also have murdered him, and that would have been of no use to anyone.
When they occupied Schwarz's old people's home on Vlaška Street and turned it into the Air Force Ministry, Stepinac took all the Jews from that care home and moved them to Brezovica. Many survived. He managed to move some of them to the island of Rab, whilst others moved to other safe houses.
When persecutions were at their worst, and we were still in our apartment, Stepinac sent us a priest, dressed in civilian clothes, who told us that the Archbishop expected us to come and sleep at the bishop's house, because there were to be raids in the area that night. Enough said, I think.
Immediately before Croatia's proclamation of independence, representatives of the national movement began demonstrating their intolerance towards Serbs. Remembering the crimes committed by the Serbian powers on Croatians and their political representatives in the period between the two world wars, old enmities emerged again in full force, seeking to revenge past wrongs. Upon hearing the news of crimes committed against the Serbs, the Archbishop of Zagreb reacted sharply in a letter to the Prime Minister Ante Pavelic.
I feel, however, that it is my duty as bishop to raise my voice and say that, in accordance with Catholic morals, this is not permissible. I therefore urge you to take the most immediate action throughout independent Croatia, ensuring that not a single Serb is killed who has not been proved to have committed a crime deserving the death penalty. Otherwise, how can we expect the blessing of heaven, without which we will undoubtedly perish?
The Archbishop firmly opposed the violent sectarian actions committed by the Croatian nationalist government. When he realized that his actions were insufficient to prevent them, he sent very clear and confidential instructions to all his priests.
When people of the Jewish or Orthodox faiths come to you, when their lives are threatened, seeking to convert to the Catholic faith, accept them in order that their lives might be saved. Do not demand any special knowledge of the Catechism, because Orthodox believers are Christians, just like us, whilst Judaism is the root of our faith. When this time of madness and extremism has passed, those who converted out of conviction will remain, whilst those who converted out of fear will return to their own faiths.
On je to jasno razlikovao.
He clearly differentiated between the two. Firstly, that it is the right of every nation, including Croatia, to live freely in their own state. And secondly, that all citizens who live among Croats should have the same rights as Croatians. He was consistent in this like no one else, for which he consequently offered up his life. And we would go to him after Mass, or to evening Mass, and listen to him preach. How he spoke about fascism, how he condemned fascism. People often looked at each other saying they could lock him up or even kill him for this.
Every man, regardless of race or nationality, whether he has a European university education or whether he hunts for food in an African jungle, every single one is equal and carries the stamp of God, the Creator, within. He has his rights, which no human or any other power can take from him or limit.
His clash with the authorities became so serious that the nationalists thought he should be removed, that he should be silenced and prevented from spreading ideas which were not in line with the official policy of Croatia's independent state. Stepinac was brave, not reckless. But I ask you, if he had persisted in pursuing more extreme measures and the nationalist regime were to crack down on him, would another bishop have been prepared to go as far and dared save anyone? One must be very wise in such situations. He did the maximum that one archbishop could do at that time, just like Pope Pius XII. He could only speak out, object, exert influence as a moral authority. Stepinac couldn't have taken up a rifle and headed for the forest. That was not his calling. I would like to be able to point out to another archbishop in Europe who was as actively opposed as he was.
On the other hand, this court case is a source of motivation for all those who disapproved of Stepinac, his work, and where he wanted to lead us, energetically endeavouring to get closer to his people, rather than prevent them from aligning themselves with foreign enemy plans to the detriment of our independent state.
They mounted the loudspeakers everywhere, broadcasting the court case proceedings against Archbishop Stepinac live. We seminarians, whether we wanted to or not, had to listen to it. Whenever we passed that way on our way to the football pitch or to church, the buzzing loudspeakers kept us quite well informed about everything that was going on. The witnesses were mainly selected according to their party credentials. Nobody could testify in Stepinac's defense. Some Serbs and Jews came out of hiding, and others turned up and wanted to testify in his favor, but none were allowed. The prosecution also pressured some priests who took part in this process, who succumbed to pressures and tortures and betrayed Stepinac, and so on. It was really a purely politically fixed trial. The Apostolic Nuncio, American Bishop Joseph Hurley, came to Zagreb and attended every court session. Every time Stepinac was led into the courtroom, he would stand up and bow before Stepinac. He thus wanted to vouch for the man's integrity, demonstrate his complete innocence, as well as to show his deep respect for his conduct, past and present.
koje je i kakve je imao u prošlosti.
Aloysius Stepinac's life was marked by world wars and totalitarian regimes, fascist, Nazi, and communist. It was a time when great empires, Austro-Hungarian and Russian, disappeared from the political scene forever, while in Central Europe, whole groups of new states came to the fore. Aloysius Victor Stepinac was born in the village of Brezaric on May 8, 1898, the fifth of 8 children of Josip and Barbara Stepinac. After finishing military service and a short period of studies in agronomy, he decided to enter the priesthood, and in 1924 began his theological studies at the Papal Gregorian University. After celebrating his first Mass in Rome's Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica, he returned to Zagreb as Master of Ceremonies to Archbishop Bauer. On June 24, 1934, Aloysius Stepinac was ordained bishop in Zagreb Cathedral. At that time, with just under 4 years of the priesthood behind him, 36-year-old Stepinac was the youngest bishop in the world. Archbishop Bauer died 3 years later, on December 7, 1937. Stepinac succeeded him as head of the Archdiocese of Zagreb on the same day.
These last 4 years have amply shown me what a thorny road a Catholic bishop must walk. I trusted in the Lord and never doubted. Instead, my faith and trust in Almighty God has grown, just as iron hardens the more it is beaten. The greater the troubles, the more my trust will grow that with God's help, I will safely pass with my flock through the winds and the storms that lie ahead.
For independence, brotherhood and union of the people of Yugoslavia in the fight for religious freedom and tolerance.
Proces organiziran je tako da
The trial was organized with communist sympathizers in the courtroom, who clapped and shouted and cheered whenever the public prosecutor spoke against Stepinac, whereas they laughed and ridiculed him on the rare occasion when he spoke.
onda je bilo ismijavanje.
I remember telling my father that we should intervene, but he said, "You know what? We cannot help him because if we try, that will be the end of us." Everyone was so afraid. That was Stalin's system. It was not fun and games.
When we heard the cannons over the Moslavina Hills near Zagreb in 1945, the last battle was being fought between the Croatian army and the partisans, after which the Croatian army withdrew. Stepinac came to us in the seminary and said, "You can see the situation for yourself. I cannot guarantee anyone's security. Nobody knows how things will turn out. The Croatian army had already retreated, and that week there was no police, or army, or anybody in Zagreb.
8. svibnja 45. kad partizani ulaze
When the partisans entered Zagreb on May the 8th, 1945, the situation was such that the nationalist government was effectively nearly collapsed, and there was nobody to take over power. Under the circumstances, the arrival of the partisans in Zagreb wasn't really awaited with as much joy as the communists like to pretend. They entered a practically empty Zagreb. People hid in their homes out of fear.
That was the beginning of one of the most terrifying episodes in Croatia's history. Within a few months and without any kind of trial, the communists killed more than 100,000 imprisoned Croatian soldiers and civilians whose bodies were later thrown into mass graves, pits and tank trenches in Slovenia and Croatia.
They immediately took the priests out first. They all had their uniforms with red crosses that clearly identified them as priests. They picked them out of the rows with great satisfaction. Recent studies indicate that 644 members of the church hierarchy were killed. 510 priests. The authorities sought to destroy the Catholic Church.
The communists immediately apprehended Archbishop Stepinac after entering Zagreb. They held him in prison for 17 days until June 4th, when he was released to meet Tito, Yugoslavia's communist leader.
When Tito suggested to Stepinac that we will come to an agreement, we will cooperate, you must just distance yourself a little from Rome. Italy is a capitalistic country that doesn't understand us. Stepinac answered decisively, we will remain faithful to Peter, just as the Catholic Church in Croatia has always been throughout its history. We will remain faithful to the Pope. That's when, one might say, the tables were turned. That's when everything turned against Stepinac. It was clear that there was no way of softening him. That's when church publishers were practically totally abolished. Catechism lessons in school were reduced and eventually banned altogether. The majority of denominational schools were closed down. Only 2 remained in Zagreb and Istria. Almost all church property was seized. Many church institutes were closed down. Nuns were dismissed from hospitals, schools, and from all such similar activities. When the procession returned from the pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady in Maria Bistrica, we waited at the cathedral to see who would preach. Stepinac led the first procession on foot, but was not allowed to go to the second one. When the bell rang in the sacristy, and Stepinac entered, we followed him with our eyes as he mounted the pulpit. And spontaneously, the whole cathedral would begin clapping. He peacefully took off his biretta and said, "My dear brothers and sisters, can I ask you not to clap in church? Because here all honor and glory are due to God and no one else." And of course we did as we were told. And then listened as he continued his homily. "We have sinned against God's every commandment. Forgive us, O God." That was the homily's message. Stepinac constantly wrote to the authorities, not only him but the other bishops too. He never received any reply. Seeing as there was no means of communication, in September 1945, together with the other bishops, he decided to write an open pastoral letter. Under the new circumstances, he sought to clarify the communist government's relationship with the Church, as well as with the whole nation. Back then, the authorities could not contemplate such a move. Yugoslavian diplomats immediately began a smear campaign around the world, claiming that Stepinac was a war criminal and head of an organization called Converting Serbs. When the nuncio, American Bishop Joseph Hurley, came to Belgrade, The first thing that Tito demanded was Stepinac's removal from Zagreb.
Kada je Tito prvi puta došao, 45.
When Tito first came to Zagreb in 1945, he also shared the stage on Ban Jelačić's square with Stepinac. He was there because it is written in the Bible, all power comes from God. But when it became clear to him that the authorities were anti-Croatian, anti-religious and against the faith and the church, Stepinac was not to be found at any of the tribunes. Rather, he was to be found in court.
To understand the gravity of the threat from all these organizations and the crime that they might perpetrate on their people,
his speech for the defense was given on October the 3rd, 1946. There was a complete silence. Everyone was following events, glued to the small radios of the time. We were maximum 30 in the seminary, all huddled together in total silence, poised to catch every word of his address. He began, "Your Honor, members of the judiciary, and all of you who are listening to this address, my conscience is at peace. I believe you are not judging me, Aloysius Stepinac, but the Archbishop of Zagreb, and that this trial in fact seeks to determine the fate of the Catholic Church." He then went on to speak extensively about all that had happened and concluded with the words, "I repeat, my conscience is clean. You can do what you want." The sentence was 16 years of confinement, plus 5 years deprivation of all civil rights. He was subsequently brought to a prison in Lepoglava. We feared he would be sentenced to death, so when we realized that it was to be 16 years imprisonment, we were even relieved. We were sure he would be executed. The Church became aware that suffering was the price that had to be paid. Just as Archbishop Stepinac suffered, so the Church, as God's people, had to suffer with him, so that the evil that had arisen could be overcome. About a month later, Bishop Dr. Josip La was the first to visit him. He said to me, "Help me carry those cases. We are going to visit the Archbishop in confinement." The guards allowed us in, and when we entered the inner courtyard, this is what we saw. About 30 to 40 meters from us, the Archbishop walking. He was walking quickly along a path laid out for him. We went into his room, unpacked, and laid all the things out on a table. We prisoners brought white rocks from the quarry, broke them with sledgehammers into little pieces. These made up the gravel path that Stepinac walked on every day, before noon and in the afternoon. It was as if we had planted flowers, tulips, annual flowers. I thought it looked like winter snow, as if the flowers were growing. Later, foreign delegations came to visit him. Often high party officials came to see what was happening there, to see if they could break him psychologically. Nobody ever accompanied him on his walks in the yard. Everybody else would be in workshops or in their cells. He was like a ghost, alone. Even the priest who was assigned to him couldn't go there. We would watch him from an upstairs window. Everything was examined before he went out on his walk, to make sure that no fellow prisoner had left a note for him or anything else. But to what avail? To what benefit? Could we save ourselves? Could he help us? Yet he was like a spirit of goodness there, a spirit of strength. Stepinac was then moved to Krasić. I can honestly say that I was even happy to be imprisoned then with the other convicts, because there was peace. After he left Lepoglava, they told us, "Oh, you would like tables and plates. Is that it, losers? You can forget it." There was no more flowers planted, nothing.
This is London calling.
You're tuned to the General Overseas Service of the BBC.
Ovde London. Britanska radio stanica daje za Jugoslaviju posljednju današnju emisiju.
Radio London.
I was listening to the radio news from London on the day when at 8:45 they announced that Archbishop Stepinac had been moved to house arrest in Krasić. After the clash with the Soviet Union, the Yugoslav authorities needed the West's help. Seeking help from the West did not go well with having Stepinac in prison. So to show the West that their attitude towards him had softened, had changed to positive, they moved him to Krasić, his hometown, and kept him under house arrest, under constant police supervision. His freedom of movement was curtailed and he was disallowed from pursuing any church work. I went immediately to Krasić by taxi the next day. There was a police officer in the yard, one on the street and one in the church grounds. They stopped us all and asked us, "Where are you going?" "We're going on an excursion into the mountains. Be careful, don't hang around Krasić. That's where war criminal Stepinac is being held." Having failed to separate Stepinac from Rome, they then tried to separate us priests from our bishop. That was when they set up the Cyril and Methodius Society of Catholic Priests of the People's Republic of Croatia. We got a circular from the diocese with an instruction that read non licet, meaning that joining this society was not possible and therefore forbidden.
Nije dopušteno iz dva temeljna razloga.
It was disallowed for two basic reasons. Firstly, because the priest society was under the patronage of the communist state. Secondly, because it implied cutting yourself off from the church hierarchy. He feared that a separatist church would eventually develop. That would then separate from the church and thereby threaten the unity of the universal church. He didn't even want to hear about it. He said that anyone who joined was not just being disobedient, it was an apostasia fidei, an apostasy of the faith.
Komunističke vlasti su pronašle.
Communist authorities found the letter from the Vatican requiring the Archbishop to ban this society. They sent a protest note accusing the Vatican of meddling in Yugoslavia's internal affairs, threatening to break off all diplomatic relations if this did not cease. In anticipation of a response from the Vatican, the authorities learned that Stepinac would be elected to the College of Cardinals. All diplomatic relations with the Vatican were immediately severed. It wasn't Stepinac the man, but rather Stepinac the moral figure that they feared. When you sit near a radiator, the heat passes into you. When we sat near Stepinac, his spirit would pass into us. Everything that he held sacred also enthused us. What he disliked, we also disliked. They called us Stepinac's priests, and we were very happy when he called us so. We communicated that spirit to the people, and they honor him to this day.
I on ga danas poštiva.
His letters from Krasić are well known. I would sometimes bring them to Zagreb illegally. They were letters of encouragement for many people. Many of those to whom he wrote also ended up in prison. His presence in our homeland was, however, very significant, in spite of his imprisonment in Leboglava and Krasić. You could detect anxiety in his letters, when he warned and often cited the scriptures. But there was at the same time evidence of an explosion of great faith and of a conviction that God would have the last word. It was just a matter of perseverance. Not even the Vatican's Eastern policy could tame him. The Vatican's Eastern policy wanted Stepinac to make concessions, even to leave Croatia and settle in Rome, where he would be well received and would live well. Stepinac most decisively rejected all such suggestions to leave Croatia. He was with his people. He suffered together with them. He gave them strength and courage and would remain with his people to the end.
Archbishop Stepinac was not entirely abandoned by the Universal Church. Many clearly understood his non-negotiable stance towards the evil of communism and the necessity to publicly give a voice to those who suffered in silence. A Norbertine priest, Father Werenfried van Straten, founder of the charity Aid to the Church in Need, also understood this well and repeatedly provided material and spiritual support to those suffering under the yoke of the Soviet Union. For Archbishop Stepinac, the simple knowledge that he was not alone eased the burden of his cross. Perhaps his greatest joy, however, came from the simple love and devotion of the Croatian faithful, who saw in him a voice that spoke on behalf of those who could not speak for themselves.
I saw him for the first time in the church in Krasić when my mother brought me to Mass. He celebrated Mass and I didn't sit very far from him. I was restless and my mother told me that Jesus is on the altar. I only saw him on the altar, so I called him Jesus. And that's what I've always called him. He was always good-humoured with a big smile on his face. I never saw him sad. I spent a lot of time with him. Of all the children in Krasić, I was with him the most. I was a little bit livelier, and I think he liked that. When I look back on it now, I think it was like a medicine for him and all his hardships. I was with him one afternoon in May. He looked out of the window of his little room and said, "People are coming to see me." 2 boys came to the door without knocking and brought him lilac flowers. They were barefoot, so the nuns didn't hear them when they came running through the hall. So he asked them, "Okay now, why did you come here, boys?" They said, "To bring you flowers." And he said, "Where did you pick them?" And they answered, "The graveyard." And then he turned to me and said, "The only lilac in the graveyard is the one on my mother's grave." So now an archbishop has to buy his mother's flowers from them. And then he said to them, "And what would you like from me?" They answered, "Will you give us some sweets?" He said that he presently didn't have any sweets with him. He used to give them sweets or something in the street. But if they were to go downstairs to the nuns, they would give them some dried figs. One of them, a small boy, said, "You're joking." He turned to me and he said, "Did you hear that? A cardinal of our Holy Mother, the Church, is joking with them?" He got up and took them by the hand and said, "Come, let us go, I will lead you there." And so he led them downstairs to the nuns. That was our Archbishop Stepinac, our saint, who in my opinion is now powerful before God. When Dr. Bogicevic came to him on Christmas Day 1959, he said to him, "Oh, your heart beats like a clock." He answered, "Doctor, it seems to me that this clock will soon stop." He died on February the 10th, 1960. He could feel it, though we never saw it in him. They called Zagreb immediately. All the cathedral bells were ringing. And we clerics went to our oratory and prayed a psalm, not only for someone who had died, but for our holy, saintly Cardinal Stepinac. The funeral was supposed to be in Krasić. Our new Archbishop, Dr. Franjo Šeper, told us to prepare everything. They even dug a place in front of the altar. Then, on the following day, a Friday, the Archbishop ruled that the funeral would, however, be in the cathedral. Who had taken that decision, I don't know. Most probably Tito. I remember how I was in church when they prepared the body for Zagreb. Our parents brought us to the church. There was a railing around the altar and we were stood in front of that railing and watched history pass us by as Krasić bid him farewell. We awaited his arrival in the cathedral on Friday until 9 in the evening. The cathedral was full, and the cathedral front as well. He was brought in a state car. The Archbishop's secretary, Father Pišonić, came and they carried him into the cathedral, and the whole cathedral. We all cried, and when he drew back the veil, everyone said, "My God, what holiness!" The solemn Requiem Mass and absolution took place on Saturday at 9 o'clock. I never saw so many people in the cathedral. They were everywhere, even climbing onto the pillars. It was a solemn requiem, during which Archbishop Šeper made a memorable address. Everybody touched his body with their rosaries. That was the first proclamation of Aloysius Stepinac's sainthood. Of course, it hit us all very hard. But we also all felt that there was something sinister. He wasn't that old. He was 62. We knew that he had been ill. But he seemed healthy and in good condition, in good shape. And that was when the rumors began, that this was the consequence of his imprisonment, or a deliberate poisoning. It was, of course, dangerous to say such things aloud, but it rapidly spread by word of mouth. What provokes doubts in my mind is the fact that he died immediately before he was due to be released. And what casts a political shadow on his death,
na slobodu,
is the oft-repeated claim by the communist authorities prior to his death that, "This man was Whatever it takes must be done to prevent Stepinac from standing at the head of the Catholic Church. That whatever it takes is very sinister.
Postulatura za proglašenje blaženstva.
The commission overseeing Archbishop Stepinac's beatification process at the Holy See has investigated the matter and accepted that he had been poisoned, and on those grounds proclaimed him blessed and a martyr.
Mučenikom I blaženim.
Onda su počela hodočašća.
Then the pilgrimages to Stepinac's grave began. Nobody could forbid it any longer. There were so many spies outside. Of course, there were especially many in the first days, but it was unstoppable. When Stepinac died in 1960, the Communist Party in Tito adopted an attitude that everything bad that had happened had been Stepinac's fault. Now he is dead, we can begin the negotiations anew. The Vatican, the Holy See, wanted to make life easier for all the faithful here, especially those Catholics living in the Eastern Bloc. It wanted to talk with the communists. When the Thorn relations came and things became a little easier, the effects did not reach us here. They continued to persecute the Church. They would claim to have a good relationship with the Vatican, except for all those bishops and priests who persevered on the same path as Stepinac, who were causing all the problems here.
Croatia today is a fully fledged member of the European Union, a free and democratic society. Although overt persecutions of the faithful are, for the moment, confined to history, and hopes of peace and prosperity dominate, a new challenge for the Church looms on the horizon, that of a radical secularization, which also has its roots in Croatia's past.
It is true that communism and the regime have fallen, but the seed remains. The criteria, the mindset still survives in many areas. It is therefore good to reflect on the words of our blessed Aloysius and his actions. Notwithstanding that this is a different time, the solutions remain very similar.
Today, Croatians as well as Catholics from all over the world make up a steady stream of pilgrims to blessed Stepinac's grave, bearing their prayers and hopes that the one that so staunchly defended them on earth will intercede for their intentions in heaven.